Hi, I'm Joseph Berg. I am interviewing Jacob Schilling at the one of the group study rooms here in the University Library. It's the 14th of January, 2015, and we're going to talk a little bit about his experiences in the Army. That's correct.
That is correct, Joseph. Thank you. I enlisted in the Army when I was age 20. I wanted to do something that had meaning because up to that point I had just been on the grind, as you might say, kind of getting the daily bread, and that's about it. So I wanted to do something that mattered. With that in mind, I enlisted as a combat medic. Now, like everyone else, my recruiter lied to me, said I'd be in a hospital. I ended up going to the 82nd Airborne Division, which is about as infantry as it gets outside of Special Forces. Now, the funny bit about that is I was with my unit 3 months when we got notice that we were going to deploy with Special Forces and Navy SEALs and Marine Force Recon and whoever else wanted to get in on the party with Special Operations Command. We had 60 days to prepare to deploy. I was as green as you can imagine, just having gotten out of my initial medic training, but I was excited, chance to again do something meaningful, that kind of thing. We all rushed to get ready, train up, all that good stuff, got assigned to my unit, and then it was upon us, basically. It wasn't exactly a conventional deployment, and a conventional deployment these days consists of tents and bases and HESCO walls and all that good stuff. You get mortared and whatnot. What we did is we went out with about 20 to 30 men per area, with us and the Navy SEALs or whoever combined. The 30 of us would take over one of their mud huts and live there, and that would be our base of operations. Things were a little roughshod, as you might imagine. We used a barrel to hold water for the shower and slept in the mud huts and all that good stuff. We got shipments of lumber in with which we built various things like bunk beds and, amenities, gear racks, that type of thing, but it was very basic.
Who built those sort of things? Did you build them yourself, or was the guys that had worked construction before they came in? Or?
Well, we were lucky enough, we had one CB from the Navy, which is slang for dude who builds stuff for the Navy. So I was with the SEALs in the first part of my deployment, so it was either SEALs or Navy. So this CB was kind of like our consultant. He built a lot of things, but more often than not, he told us what to build. And we would try and figure it out ourselves. Now, I took a woodshop course or two back in my day, so I was okay. But there were some pretty ugly projects coming out of a couple of the other guys. But yeah, I mentioned that because materials were scarce. You didn't really want to mess up because you were stuck with what you built.
That makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, we were with Special Operations Command, so we had decent funding, but supply lines being what they were, if air was red or ground was red, you didn't get anything.
So what exactly did that mean, to be red?
That means no transportation at all. Air would be by helicopter and ground would be by convoy.
So what would make the conditions turn red?
Well, for the air, the birds won't fly if the weather's bad or if visibility is poor. So something as unpredictable as a windstorm can take down air, and there go your 2 weeks of supplies. Whereas the ground being red, that would usually have something to do with IED attacks in the area to an extent greater than was deemed safe to actually travel on.
Were you there in the winter?
Yes, I was.
Did it make a difference in how you could get supplies or how easily y'all could move around the countryside?
It was a little quieter in the winter. The ground was harder, so the locals didn't want to dig in any bombs for us, or at least as many. So we were usually able to convoy better. Air was about the same. They're always pretty fickle. But yeah, the brunt of the aggression we bore in the summer. which I got into country in May of 2011, right as things were starting to kick off. And it was interesting, actually. That reminds me of something that happened. I had been at our remote site for about a week, just enough time to get settled in a little bit, and as the medic, kind of create my little casualty zone where I would treat casualties if they came in, and that kind of thing. And I was the only medic on site, so it was...
So your responsibility, if a casualty came in, was to provide care for how long?
Well, that depends on if air is red or not, for example. I cared for casualties between 30 minutes if they were very acute, or there were times when I sat my casualty for over an hour because air was backed up. And then there were also, we were trying to win hearts and minds, and so I would provide sick call, which is basically for the locals. I would let them come up and say, hey, I feel sick, and I would talk through the interpreter with them and give them rudimentary medical care. And so some patients like that I saw for months, depending upon their ailment.
What was the impression you had of the health of the Afghans you saw?
Well, the health wasn't great. Not a lot of access to clean water, open sewage in the streets, that kind of thing. Very unhygienic. And, in the markets, their meat is just hanging out in the air, kind of exposing themselves to a lot of things. And due to being a developing country, they aged very rapidly.
Huh. So the people looked older than they were.
Yes. Men of about 50 had wrinkles that were half an inch deep, and I wish I were exaggerating that. But the sun and the wind and the dust and everything just combined to age them very quickly. There was one old fellow who came to me during sick call. He said, hey, my feet hurt and I'm old. I said, well, if I lived as long as you in Afghanistan wearing your little slippers, my feet would hurt too. Of course, I said that to myself, told the Turk not to pass that one across.
So had you in essence, you were a paramedic with your own medical practice.
Right. I was all the way up to family medicine, general practitioner. For those 30 guys, I was it. And they had to make do. Now, they taught us a lot of trauma medicine in medic school, but not a lot of illness medicine or internal medicine. So what I ended up doing is borrowing a few medical textbooks from another aid station and reading them constantly, trying to gain knowledge enough to treat anything that would come along.
So the intent was never for you to deal with chronic illness or anything that would be triaged as routine, I don't suppose.
Right. Anything classed under illness, period, it would kind of be out of the scope of a medic just out of training like I was. Over the course of a career, a medic gains that knowledge by performing sick call under the supervision of a physician's assistant in the United States. But since I had not had much opportunity to do that, my knowledge was lacking, and that's why I chose to remedy it myself.
Had you worked with any real patients prior to deployment?
Just in sick call, just with the sniffles or what have you, but no blood, no bodies, none of that.
So you hadn't ridden along on ambulances, or in your training they hadn't actually put you in a hospital environment and said, do your job as...
That's correct. We would have mock casualties when we trained with the infantry. We would convince them to put a casualty in their training scenario so that we could get some training too. But I had not yet had the opportunity to do some of the medic training that was available to create mock situations like that. And for the most part, it was mock situations that we would be trained on. There was some very good training pre-deployment where we had very realistic moulage, which is like wound dressing, making something look like a wound, and so we were prepared as best they could with 60 days notice, but again, with 60 days notice, you kind of have to hit the ground running.
So, and I don't want to get too far off course, but there are two other questions that kind of come into my mind. One, you were attached to a Navy outfit for a lot of your time in Afghanistan. So, who looked after you?
Well, that's a good question. Since I had been just latched onto my infantry squad extremely recently, as in right when we found out we were deploying, it's, hey, we're assigning you to this guy, because it was a very different setup. Most of the time you get one medic per platoon,
Mm-hmm.
and a platoon has 3 to 4 squads. Well, in this case, it was one medic per squad. And so I got latched onto a group of new guys. They didn't know me. They didn't really care about me that much because I was the new guy, or the FNG, as you might call it. But the person who really looked after me the most was my senior medic, and he would operate at kind of the supply base, the hub, which supplied various different isolated outposts like my own, each with their own medic.
So it was from day to day, you were reporting to the squad leader, but the person that was paying attention to you in your role as the medic was the senior medic for the area?
That's correct. And he was doing all he could too. We did things like we practiced sutures on oranges we took from the dining facilities when we were still in the bigger bases together before we had broken out and spread. We stayed up late quizzing each other on various ailments and the HABCs, which are how you treat trauma. So again, they did their best, but in the end, I'm one guy among 30 in the middle of nowhere.
So did you feel like there were situations where you weren't prepared for what you came up against?
From a supply standpoint, I would say so, and I can actually get into that if you'd like. It's a bit of a story.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we're recording, is stories.
Okay. Well, I had been at my outpost for about a week, kind of settled in, created a casualty area with its one stretcher and one extra aid bag, in addition to the patrol aid bag I kept for myself. And I had, at this point, trained my infantrymen in basic first aid, what they call combat life-saving skills.
Mm-hmm.
I had trained them so that they could assist me if I needed them. So about a week in, it is early in the morning. Everyone was asleep except for the guy on watch. And the guy on watch, funny, skinny little Navy guy who never thought he'd see the sun, I imagine, bursts into the room. He just yells, he's like, "Doc, we got someone." And, you know, they always tell you about that in training. They're like, "This'll happen, you won't be prepared, you'll have to get up and go." Well, a week into my outpost, there I was, throwing on flip-flops in my pajamas, running out the door after grabbing my aid bag. This guy had stepped on an anti-personnel mine that the Taliban had planted on his little guard shack, so that when he walked into it to assume his post, it blew off most of his lower leg below the knee. The only thing that remained was actually his tibia and fibula, perfectly preserved, and a curtain of flesh hanging from his knee.
Wow.
It was rather grotesque. One of my infantrymen vomited, actually, when he saw it, but I didn't have the luxury. I had to get right on him, and together with the SEAL chief, the SEAL team chief, who was reporting the situation up, I was able to stabilize him, treat him as a casualty, and since he was one of the local nationals' security force, we were able to evacuate him after about 30 minutes. And that wasn't too bad. That felt really good, you know.
So he was
First
an
test.
Afghan?
He was. And, you know, that kind of felt like the first test of my medic skills, if you will. But I was prepared, we had the equipment, all that kind of thing. Where the lack of equipment comes in is right after we had finished resetting everything, which, you know, restocking my aid bags and putting the stretcher back and that kind of thing, we hear another explosion. I'm like, oh, well, here we go. At least we're already up and about, right? What had happened in this case is some security force local nationals were driving in their pickup truck and hit an IED. So that brought us 3 casualties. One was dead on arrival, the other had minor wounds, and the third was in a bad way. Now, we only had 1 stretcher. So the dude with minor wounds, we actually had to put on a piece of plywood to carry him around. And since we had just requested a medevac, they told us to sit on the casualties for over an hour, despite the fact that they were acutely injured in the one fellow's case. Now this is where my infantrymen with training came in, because I only have 1 set of hands, and I was able to direct them to provide care for the minimally wounded male and to talk to him to try and keep him from going into shock, because I wasn't sure if he had internal bleeding or anything like that. Well, I myself and an assistant worked primarily on the fellow with multiple traumas. His legs had been pulverized. I'm fairly certain he had internal bleeding. And like I said, we sat on him for an hour, and it was a sad occasion because right as I heard the helicopters coming over the mountains, his status declined drastically. And he was alive when I put him on the bird, but I just had this feeling that he wasn't going to pull through, and that turned out to be the case. We found out later he didn't make it.
How did you find out about your patients? I mean, once you put them on the helicopter to evacuate them, did you find out in every case what happened, or was it just sort of word of mouth back?
Mostly word of mouth. We found out about the guy who died. I found about that from my senior medic, but the fellow previous to him who had lost half his leg, he actually came back around later and visited us to thank us.
Well, did they wind up amputating his leg, or?
Yes, they did.
So did he have a prosthetic, or was he just on a crutch?
Just on the crutch.
Wow.
Yeah, crutching around rocky Afghanistan. Still happy looking. That's one thing I'll say for the Afghans. They are very, very good at dealing with pain and hardship.
Well, I did want to ask you kind of about that because, people are people. We have cultural differences, but what was your impression about the difference in the culture of the Afghans that you work with? Because you clearly had Afghans that you work with very closely every day.
Yes. Well, the primary cultural difference that I noticed, and I'm not even sure if I would call it a difference really, was just being very close-mouthed, at least around us, but I also got the impression around others as well. Within the family unit, things were very private, especially for the females. Once they were married into a family unit, they hardly even left the compound unless it was for a celebration, like a wedding or something to that effect. Their lives were very limited in that sense, and the males told us as little as possible in most cases, and they never wanted to show weakness in front of us. When they were injured, they were always stone-faced, dealing with the pain. Even the children, actually. There was one child who had third-degree burns on his legs and arms, muffled every single cry of pain as we were trying to debride the burns, which are excruciatingly painful. What's interesting to me is that what caused him to start crying and screaming was when he found out we wanted to put him on a helicopter. And our interpreter told us that was because helicopters were essentially death to the Afghans, because we would call in fire support and that kind of thing. So through all that excruciating pain, he was able to endure and be stoic, but as soon as he found out helicopters were coming, he broke down.
Did he have anyone with him?
He had, I think, an uncle with him who convinced him that it needed to be done, because his uncle understood a little bit better about the complexity of the world, wasn't quite as black and white, simple, and so that was good. Another cultural patient that was interesting, we had a woman who was bitten by a snake. We treated her initially, sent her off, and then they sent her back to us for long-term care, which we weren't really equipped or trained for, but we ended up changing the dressing on her necrotic flesh every other day for a few months. Now the interesting thing about this is we never saw her face. The only part of her we ever saw that wasn't draped in a blanket was the part of her leg we were changing the dressing on.
Mm-hmm.
They wheeled her in a wheelbarrow. Her husband was at her shoulder the entire time. We didn't talk to her, we talked to the husband and never saw her.
Even though you saw her every other day.
Right. Even though we treated her constantly, we never knew who she was. We never heard her even speak. So it was different.
So you said that you worked most of your tour with the Navy. Whom else did you work with in Afghanistan?
About the last third, I think it was, of my deployment, I worked with Special Forces, the Army Special Forces.
Mm-hmm.
And that was less eventful because by then the fighting season had wound down. But I mean, overall, I liked the SEALs better just because they were very no nonsense. Since the Special Forces were part of the Army also, they had the same rank structure, that same kind of thing. They wanted to have their little power play games and that kind of nonsense, whereas the SEALs were just, hey, you're here to help us, let's work together, let's have a good relationship.
Interesting. So it was actually more friction inside your own service than there was working with members of a different service?
That's correct.
Wow. So looking back on this, do you talk about this? Is this the story you share with people?
It depends on which people you mean. As far as medical contemporaries, this is probably the go-to story for me.
Mm-hmm.
I could share the story about how I was in the shower one time and we got a casualty from an Afghan tried to shoot a dog and he shot his friend. But I mean, there are funnier stories like that. But this is the kind of real talk story if you want to really get a sense of what it was like as a medic over there in austere conditions. There are a couple others too, but I don't really like to talk about the stories where U.S. service members were injured. Those hit a little close to home, because when you're living within 30 meters of these guys constantly, it means a lot when they go down, and you know that's pretty personal.
So, to touch on that lightly, how do you function when it's somebody that you know closely?
It's a lot of compartmentalization, a lot of suppression. I didn't deal with the grief until I was back in the U.S. And even then, I mean, this happened back in 2011, like I said, but it wasn't until a few months ago in therapy that I fully dealt with the grief. And that allowed me to function in the moment to provide proper medical care, but I felt it later.
You sort of pack it away?
Right.
So it's 2015, you're clearly not in the Army now. So we're 4 years later. What got you from there to here? So you served your country in Afghanistan, and then what sort of decisions did you make after that?
Well, interestingly enough, at this point in my life, I am a Buddhist and a conscientious objector. And how that came to be is I had come home from Afghanistan. I was still with my unit, with the 82nd. And we were just going about our business, but I had horrible insomnia. I couldn't sleep. My mind was always racing. Some of the other effects, like the hypervigilance and whatnot, you don't really notice when you're still in the Army because it's a way of life. They were there, but they didn't really matter. But I couldn't sleep, and that was a big deal, because I can't function as well. I can't make good medical decisions when I can't sleep. So I went to see a therapist about it, trying to get some sleep any way I could, and after hearing my situation, my inner turmoil, she recommended I research what a conscientious objector was because I had no idea at the time. And it turns out it fit because just prior to my deployment, I talked with an old Vietnam War vet who taught me how to meditate.
Mm-hmm.
He gave me stuff to read about it, and we talked about it and that kind of thing. And the meditation helped get me through a lot of the situations in Afghanistan that I had to deal with. So when I got home, I researched more into that and slowly started to become a Buddhist because it was a very positive spiritual thing for me. And so after I talked to the therapist, I started the conscientious objector paperwork, and in the end I only got out a few months earlier than I would have anyway. But the conscientious objector status, which, if you don't know what that means, it means that I object to war on spiritual grounds. Now, as a logical man, is it necessary in this world of violence? Yes. But as a personal choice, I chose to no longer participate in it, and the government recognizes that. And whereas most people are on an inactive reserve after they fulfill their initial contract, I am not because of that. So I cannot be called back if we were to get into another war and have a troop shortage.
Though there's a long American tradition of this. I mean, Alvin York, the famous Sergeant York of the First World War, was a conscientious objector.
It's interesting you mention him because he served in my battalion.
Really?
Yes, the 1st and 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Here's one of the names I had to memorize.
The hero of the 82nd, that's right. Do people understand that choice when you tell them about it?
If they've deployed to a combat area, they understand. Most of them understand that it's inhumane, the entire process. It's horrible, really. But they make their own personal choices about it, and I support their choices the same way they support mine. They are willing to get back out there again and stay in the fight with their personal conscience and spirituality, and I support that 100%. And most of the people who have seen real combat support my decision too, is what I've found. Of course, there are the ignorant people who haven't actually experienced combat or the death of a close friend who don't understand. They don't understand the dehumanizing effect that war has because it hasn't had that effect on them, and they'll make their little mockeries or what have you, but it doesn't matter. What's important is that my peers in this sense who have seen combat support my decision and respect it.
I'm talking to other veterans, one of the things I've observed is that it seems like service members that saw combat are a little bit more preoccupied with existential questions. Like, why am I here? What is my purpose? What is my calling? Has that been the case for you?
In a sense, I would say, if you recall, I joined in the first place to do something meaningful, so I was already kind of on an existential quest, if you will. But especially once you've seen combat, and most especially if someone close to you has died, you question. If you don't, then you're either being obtuse to protect yourself, or you don't have the capability for existential thought, which is fine, but everyone I served with has had those questions, and as the medic I would field a fair few of those and try and keep them going, because that was my function. My function wasn't to baby them while we were deployed, but to keep them combat ready. In the same way I stunted my own emotional health, sometimes I had to do so for theirs also, but a lot of people had those questions and none of us had very good answers.
So it was like putting on an emotional tourniquet?
Exactly. Just stop the bleeding, keep going.
So, how do you feel about medicine now?
Well, I'm in the nursing program here at UCCS, so I still love medicine, and I'm still able to deal with bodies and gore and trauma and all that good stuff. It doesn't really bother me when it's impersonal, which there's a reason in medical ethics you can't treat your own family. You know, these guys we're living with in Afghanistan, they're like family, and that's why it messed me up, and that's why it messes a lot of medics up, because we are so close to our patients. In the real world, I won't be that close to my patients. I'll have the, basic doctor-patient emotional connection. Hey, I care about your well-being, but it won't tear me apart if they don't make it or their health regresses or what have you. So I'm still pursuing a medical career. I still think it's a great way to have meaning in life and to provide a positive impact on others.
That's awesome. I commend you for that. Does it make it difficult sometimes to work with other students that don't have the experiences that you have?
You could call it difficult at times. A lot of my peers in the nursing program have had experience as like a certified nursing assistant, which is great because it's kind of that clean hospital medicine experience that I haven't had as much of. But when, we go through the units on trauma, or, I have answers that we haven't learned yet and people ask me why, sometimes it's hard to just quietly say, well, I was a medic. Because to me that's a pretty loaded statement with my history behind it, but I try and keep it within myself, and maybe that's my own machismo army programming coming out, not showing the emotion and whatnot. But it's a little hard mostly when they complain about first world problems. I remember specifically we were having a test, and the morning of test day before the test, this whole gaggle of young girls is stressing and freaking out and feeding each other stress and that kind of thing. And I just kind of shook my head, and one of the older former CNAs in the class who was sitting near me leaned over and said, "It's okay. They just don't know what a real test is yet."
No, it is. It's a question of relative suck, I guess.
Yes.
What would you say you're most proud of in your service?
Well, despite the fact that I am a conscientious objector and a Buddhist, I am proud of my deployment. I am proud that I was able to support my guys, my infantry guys, my SEALs, whoever I was with. I'm proud that I was able to do my job completely and fully. They never had to go to another medic. They never had to question me. They all respected my ability. So much so that, like I said earlier, when I did, decide to become a conscientious objector, all of them supported me because they knew I had been in it. I had done my job. I had paid my dues, as it were. I wasn't just some shitbag trying to sham out of his contract or whatever. So I'm very proud of being there for my fellow soldier the way I was. I never let them down.
It's funny, as we're talking, I'm hearing a lot of the terms that are colloquial in the Army. Sham, the F and G. There's a jargon to it that kind of takes you back to certain times and places. Just like there's a jargon in the medical profession. What do you associate most with the lifestyle?
The Army lifestyle?
Yeah.
Readiness to do violence. Now that's probably because I was in an infantry unit,
Mm-hmm.
and there was a tremendous sense of pride there, of always being ready to do what you were trained to do. And in the infantry, that's violence. And as a medic, I obviously wasn't fully into that, but we were always trained as a shooter first, medic second, because until there was a casualty, we were shooting.
So you were armed.
Absolutely.
Was there any expectation that anyone that was opposing you was going to respect your status as a medic or as a notional non-combatant?
Not a chance. Now, we did use M4s, which are considered sidearms by the Geneva Conventions, which are appropriate for medics to carry and use in self-defense. And so I would fire if fired upon, which were the rules of engagement for everyone at that point in the deployment anyway. So we were still within the Geneva Conventions, but to expect our opponents to respect a red cross would be suicidal, actually, because then they would target that.
Mm-hmm.
They would take you out so that you couldn't save the lives of the other people injured in the attack.
Now, one last question that occurs to me to ask. You see movies about Navy SEALs and movies about Green Berets, and there's a certain depiction in Hollywood. How would you say that the reality of knowing American Special Operations Forces stacks up to what you see in the movies?
Well, I'll be honest, I haven't seen a lot of those movies, probably because, like you said, I served with them. What I will say about the Navy SEALs is that they're extremely professional. They get the job done, they do it right, but I'll also say they are jokers a lot of the time, keep the spirits up, and they're what we would call Hollywood, which is, they worked out a lot, we all did, but you know, they worked out a lot and they would wear the short shorts and the stuff showing off and would always be trying to top each other and that kind of thing. They had a very large dedication to excellence, and that came out in competition a lot. And so it would be a friendly competition more often than not, you know, just who can squat the most or who's the most badass or what have you. But when it came down to business, it was all business. There was no joking around. There was, let's get the job done and let's get home in one piece, which actually made all of us feel a lot safer. It's interesting because we would always hear that, you know, we were going to the shit, as if you've seen Full Metal Jacket.
Right.
That's what they called it back in Nam, but we were going to the shit. We were as far forward as it got. Like I said, the mud huts, all that good stuff. But the fact that we were doing things in such a highly professional manner made us all feel safer, actually, than if we had been on your normal deployment acting as landmine detectors with wheels.
So you felt like you had more personal responsibility for your fate?
Yes, absolutely. And that gave us comfort because we were all highly competent. And so it gave us a sense of, well, since we are so good at our jobs, we're probably going to be okay. We were proved wrong a little by unlucky fate, but we all know that the dice roll each time we step outside the wire.
Right.
We just do everything we can to stack the odds in our favor.
Well, before we wrap up the interview, is there anything else that you think it might be important for somebody listening to this down the road to hear about or know about?
I suppose if there's one thing I could say, it's don't take things lightly. The experiences of other people is what I mean by that. Don't take them lightly. Because although, for example, myself with the machismo programming and all that, I don't show it. I don't show its effects on me. I don't show anything publicly for the most part. It does affect me. And it's had a profound effect on my life. So when someone shares their experiences with you, it matters. It's a big deal. It's not just something you say, oh, well, that was cool. You know, that was their life, and it was probably more profound than what most civilians go through in half of their lives. And that's what I would say, really. Just treat it with respect.
Appreciate that. Okay, well, we'll wrap things up. Again, this is the 14th of January, 2015, here at the library at UCCS. I'm Joseph Berg, and I've been interviewing Jacob Schilling, and thanks for your time. It's been a good interview.